Right, shall I assume I should start then, Claire?
Yes,
Hopefully everyone who's here is looking forward to a session on the practical path to net zero carbon for church buildings. Very good. Let me share my screen and we can get going. Right, Claire, give me a thumbs up if that's appeared. Excellent. So we've got about 45 minutes thinking about our buildings, what we're going to do on our buildings. I want to start by just saying this isn't just a theory. There are net zero carbon church buildings out there. So we've just done the analysis of the first year of the energy footprinting tool, and 5% of our churches are already net zero. I know that's only 5%, but still, when you think that's, you know, that's, we've got 15,000 churches. So that's a good, I'm trying to do my math now, 300 churches which are already net zero carbon. And generally it's because they've got electric heating and they've switched over to 100% renewable electricity tariff. So these two churches here are both net zero carbon churches. And don't they just look exactly like any other beautiful church? They don't look like scary modern buildings that have, you know, done lots of technical interventions. St Michael's Baddesley, rural church, they switched to LED lighting, they've put in place electric pew heating, they've got 100% green electricity tariff, which means that their electricity is clean. They've worked out the residual of their carbon footprint each year from travel, and they offset that with climate stewards. So they are a net zero carbon church. St Michael and All Angels Withington, the first thing they did, I think, is a really interesting thing, which is they first looked at reducing their floodlighting hours. And the reason I like that as a place to begin is because it saved them money and it saved them energy. So they consulted with their community. So we currently run our floodlighting this many hours a week. What are your views about us cutting it back? The community agreed. So they reduced their floodlighting. So for an expenditure of zero, they saved money, they saved energy. They then started investing that money that they'd saved in getting LED lighting, which cut their energy use. They first installed biomass boiler, but then they really struggled with that. And so now they've got electric pew heating. They have solar panels up here behind this parapet. Those solar panels are generating more electricity per year than they use. So they are a net zero church. And I just wanted to start straight away with that to say, you know, this is real. This is something that some churches are already doing. This is something that other churches can aspire to do, is getting to be a net zero carbon church. It's not just a crazy idea. In terms of what I'm going to cover, why net zero carbon, actually, I'm going to pretty much skip that because Andy did it so beautifully in his talk. But then I'll look at what is net zero carbon, where are we starting from, what might a net zero carbon church look like, how might we get there, and then to begin with gathering data. A bit of time at the end, depending on when other people come back from their workshops for questions. Why net zero? I'll blast past this. Andy covered it beautifully. We know it from the changing weather. We know it from the science. We know General Synod has set us the target to do it. We know it's firmly rooted in our mission, the fifth mark of mission, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. But it weaves through all 5 marks of mission. So let's get into the more practical stuff. What is zero carbon anyway? So for any building, you take the energy use, the oil, the gas, the electricity, and you can multiply that by some absolutely standard conversion factors, which are produced by the government each year. And you add to that, taking the fuel from reimbursable travel, and you multiply that travel. So how many kilometers were done in a petrol car, and you multiply that again by absolutely standard conversion factors. And when you add those two together, that gives you the majority of the church's gross carbon footprint. There's then 2 things you can take off that. One of which is if the electricity is 100% renewable, either because you're purchasing it from a green tariff or because you're generating it from your roof. And you can take off any valid carbon offsets or carbon sequestration. So carbon offsets is sort of like a trade where you pay a little bit of money so that somewhere else in the world, they're reducing their greenhouse gases. That might be, for example, planting trees elsewhere in the world, or increasing the energy efficiency of buildings or transportation somewhere else in the world. Whereas carbon sequestration is the phrase for when carbon is being captured out of the air into a solid or liquid form. And in our world, that mostly means tree planting, rewilding, improving the soils. So once you've taken those 2 things off, That gives you the majority of a church's net carbon footprint. And it's that net carbon which we have been tasked so prophetically by General Synod to try and get that to zero by 2030. So net zero carbon is reducing the energy we use, reducing the fuel that we use, and then the residual, ensuring it's coming from clean sources or it's offset. It's important to have in mind the difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. Operational carbon is what we use in running our building. So it's things like the gas for our heating, the lights, the electricity we're using to run our lights. That's the operational carbon. The embodied carbon is what it's taken to manufacture, transport, and install those things. And whilst operational carbon is what we normally focus on because it's what we can easily measure through our utility bills, but embodied carbon is really important to have in mind as well, because if you're going to do a massive building project and only save a small amount of operational carbon, then environmentally that isn't the right thing to do, because it would take too many years environmentally for those operational carbon savings to be paid back. So for example, if you only run your heating 3 hours a week, it's not going to make sense to lift up the floor, put down underfloor heating and have a heat pump, because the embodied carbon in that big project would take so many years to pay back through the small operational carbon savings. However, if you are running your heating all week round, most of the year, then that's a very different thing. Where are we starting from? I always like to begin with this, to say we have some of the most sustainable buildings in Britain. We have buildings that are still fulfilling the purpose for which they were built centuries ago. This church here, St. Martin in Canterbury, has been used continuously as a church since at least the 6th century, possibly the 4th century. There's Roman materials in its walls. Many of our churches were built at the time with local materials, so they have a very low embodied carbon even at the time. And how many modern buildings going up now could possibly think that they will still be delivering the purpose for which they're being built 500 years from now? So in that sense, we have some of the most sustainable buildings in Britain. However, they're generally not very easy to heat and quite expensive to run. So we know that our carbon footprint is significant. The 2012 baseline study, which is the most recent one that we have that looks at all different building types, showed that the total energy carbon footprint of the Church of England, thinking of our churches, our schools, our clergy housing, all of our types of building, was between 600,000 and 1 million tons of CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's only looking at energy. So that study didn't even try and look at transport materials or procurement of food waste. So we know we've got a big carbon footprint. And we also know that our church buildings cost us a lot to run, and therefore savings, financial savings, are potentially very significant. So this is looking across all of the dioceses of the Church of England, but this is 2019 data. If you look at the utilities across the 42 dioceses with £34.5 million, major repairs 128 million, new buildings 60 million. So tackling these and becoming more energy efficient will potentially save us a significant amount of money in the utilities line. Maintaining our buildings well is good environmentally and good financially. These repair bills might come down. And also in terms of the answer as to where is the money going to come from, part of that is we're already spending a lot of money on our buildings, but when we invest this £60 million every year, can we do it in a way which increases environmental efficiency at the same time? The 2012 study showed us a lot about where our carbon footprint is as a church. There's a little bit more than half being on our schools, because even though we have 3 times as many churches as schools, with our schools, the heating is on for the majority of the time, the lighting is on for the majority of the time, and it's at a temperature suitable for the children. Churches is about 2/5 of our carbon footprint, clergy housing the biggest slice after that. But really importantly, if you look at energy use in churches, you see it varies enormously. So this is a study where we took 165 churches and halls. Each of these columns is one church or one hall. The orange is their gas or oil, the blue is their electricity. And what you can see is there's an incredibly long tail of churches that already have a very low carbon footprint. A lot of our churches have only got their heating and lighting on a few hours a week. Their carbon footprint is already very low. So the interventions that you need in these buildings are really very simple. They're things like clearing the gutters, fixing the broken windows, and switching to renewable electricity. And then your carbon footprint is so small, you've got a little bit left to offset. Compared to on the right-hand side, these are our bigger churches, which are being used throughout the week. So they've got their heating on throughout the week, they've got their lighting on throughout the week, they've got a much higher energy use. And that's where it makes sense to start looking at some of the bigger projects, like shall we put in a whole new low carbon heating system? Shall we look at solar panels? Shall we do a big, lighting project? I've already mentioned the word heating a lot of times. I spend a lot of my time talking about heating because we know that that is the vast majority of church energy use. This was a study looking at 126 churches and halls, dividing up where they were using their energy between lighting, heating, and other uses like audiovisual. And heating was 84%. And it makes sense if you just stop and think about it, that big space, the big space that we're trying to make warm and the energy that it takes to try and make that big space warm. So if you've got enough energy to worry about one thing for your church, I would take that time thinking about your heating and planning ahead as to how you might be able to reduce the amount of heat that you use and how you might replace your current heating with a lower carbon option when that time comes. The energy audits process that we've done a whole range of church energy audits, and then we've analysed the results. And this analysis here is from 181 church energy audits. And they give us some really good pointers about where we should be focusing our efforts. So the most common recommendation that's come up in 173 out of 181 audits was to switch to 100% renewable electricity. And I would put money on the fact that the other 8, it's because they'd already done it. The second most common thing is about lighting. Now, we saw in that pie chart, lighting is quite a small slice, but it comes up very regularly in the energy audits because lighting is something it's relatively quick to fix and you get a relatively fast payback. Most churches have done their main lights, but a lot of them have got secondary rooms, or they've got more complicated bulbs, or they've got the higher up bulbs. And that comes out very regularly in our energy audit process, is that getting all of the lighting over to LED is a really useful thing to do. After that, nearly all of the recommendations have got something to do with heating. So it's either about reducing your heat loss. So that's looking at things like different forms of insulation, tackling the windows. Although I should be absolutely clear, my conservation colleague is sitting on my shoulder saying this does not mean the main stained glass church windows. The energy audits have recommended double and secondary glazing for things like church halls, offices, vestries. It's vanishingly rare that it makes sense to do it for the main church windows. And draft proofing. Draft proofing comes up so regularly in the energy audits. And then it's looking at the heating itself. Often that's about optimizing the system you have now. So improving your heating controls, making sure your heating settings are correct, or reducing your background heating hours, reducing your background heating temperature. These are all things which can help you get your existing system to be more efficient. And then some of the audits are looking at changing the heating to a new low carbon solution, or in a few cases, putting a more efficient new gas boiler in. So what might a zero carbon church look like? This is our church. It's quite a simple one in my little diagram, but you can imagine your own church. We want to make it a zero carbon church. Where do we start? So one thing is to remember that we've got some advantages. Generally, our church is made with local materials, low embodied carbon. A lot of them have a very high thermal mass, which means they retain heat. You don't have quite the same peaks and troughs. A lot of them have high solar gain through those big windows. And a lot of them have grounds around for planting. So we've got some advantages that we can start with. Now let's talk about the principles of how we run our zero carbon church. 6 principles. The first is well maintained. This is not the most exciting thing to think about, but actually it's a really important thing to remember, is if you're thinking, where do we begin with becoming a zero carbon church? Start by maintaining your building. Second, switching to renewables, because it's the easiest thing we can do that makes a difference. Wasting less of everything, wasting less energy, water, just wasting less. Where possible, and this will take time to achieve, switching away from gas and oil to lower carbon heating solutions, and generally those are electric, and your electricity can be combined with a renewable electricity tariff. For some churches, although not all, looking at how you can generate more of your own electricity from solar panels, and then offsetting the remainder. So our zero carbon church, I'm going to show you a buffet of things that can be done. I'm going to show you the menu. You're going to have to think in your own mind through your own church which bits of this are relevant to you. We would never expect to come to a church and see everything done in one place, but I'm showing you the menu. So number one thing, well-maintained roof, well-maintained gutters. We do not have water coming in, we do not have air blasting through, we do not have leaves blocking up the gutters, because all of those things will mean that you're having to run your heating system far more than you need to, because the air is damp and because there is cold air blowing through. LED floodlights. Our net zero carbon church will almost certainly have installed, changed any floodlights that they already have and path lights that they already have to low energy alternatives. You might have something like a water butt that's catching some of the water off your roof that you can use for the grounds. You'll have done something about your windows. Now that's a complicated subject all in itself, but heat loss from the windows will in some way, you'll have attempted to reduce that, and draft proofing of doors. When I look in the car park of my zero carbon church, you'll probably see bike racks, EV car charging. Some of them will have moved to lower carbon heating solutions like heat pumps. Some of them will have looked at putting appropriate external renders or external insulation, although that's more likely to be in a modern building or in a church hall. And some of them you'll see solar panels on the roofs of your zero carbon church. Looking at the inside, what kind of things might we see in the menu for the inside? So LED lighting, absolutely low energy lighting. Loft insulation, if you've got a void or if you are re-roofing anyway. Loft insulation is always something to get good advice about though, because if you've got historic timber up there and you do the loft insulation incorrectly, you can cause issues with damp and condensation. Low carbon heating, there's a whole variety of different potential sources of low carbon heating, but things like pew or panel heating. Soft furnishings, rugs on the floors, cushions on the pews, ways that allow people to keep their body heat. You might have internal draft curtains or a lobby around the door so that cold air isn't coming into the building with people. You might have done some partitioning to create smaller spaces which are easier to heat. If you've got those solar panels, maybe you've got battery storage on the wall of your zero carbon church. Heating and lighting is likely to be zoned and timed. So different areas of the church, you can have the lighting and the heating on in those zones where you need it, when you need it. And this is one which is quite an interesting thing, is around thinking to the future, should we be varying our service times with the seasons? This is what used to happen in the past, is the service would be in the afternoon in winter, it would be more likely to be in the morning in the summer, because you want the solar gain through the windows to have warmed up your church in the winter. And energy efficient appliances, low flush toilets in the kitchens and in the bathrooms. I'm very quickly going to touch on being a biodiverse church, because that's not what the topic is today, but I can't resist saying a little bit about it. In your biodiverse church, your trees are going to be protected, maybe some new trees planted, wildlife habitats, long grass with wildflowers in part of the grounds, perhaps veg beds, bat boxes, swift boxes. Those are the kind of things that allow your church to be one that's caring for nature, as well as and dealing with the ecological crisis as well as the climate crisis. Right, that's a little bit overwhelming, isn't it? Thinking, well, there's 50 different things she's just told us we should do. So where do you start? So the place to start is with the practical path to net zero. I put that link originally in my slot this morning. In fact, Claire, maybe can you find it whilst I'm talking? Can you find the link through the practical path to net zero and put it in the chat? The practical path to net zero is designed to break it down for you into simpler steps. So it begins with, where do we start? And the idea is that these are things which are relevant even for low energy using churches over on the left hand side of that graph at the beginning. What next? these are the kind of interventions you might be thinking about if you're a church that's used maybe 3 or 4 times a week, so sort of medium energy use. The bigger projects, the getting to zero ones, are really only going to make sense if you're a high energy use church. You're already busy throughout the week, you've got quite a lot of energy already being expended. And then there's some kind of only if things which you would do in very particular circumstances. So where do we start? These are things like maintenance, maintaining roof, gutters, broken windows, insulate around pipes, deal with drafts, soft furnishings, rugs, floor coverings, cushions, switching to renewables, making sure that your heating timings are set to the use of the building, looking at timers and smart controllers. So things like having a controller on your water urn so that it's only heating up the water when you need it. Antifreeze and anti-sludge filter in the heating system so that this is if you've got a wet radiator system, so that they run as efficiently as possible. Making those easy LED replacements and behavioural changes so that people are only turning things on when they're needed. So basically this kind of where do we start section in the practical path to net zero is about simple steps that don't cost the earth. I love these thermal imaging camera photographs because they bring it to life. Where it's red, it's warmer, where it's blue, it's colder. This is showing you the bottom of a church roof, at the bottom of a church door. I'm mixing up my roofs and my doors. And you can just see the cold air coming under this door. You know, that just needs some draft proofing. I know that can be tricky if it's an old door, but the theory is simple. This is a photograph of a pew just after these 5 people have stood up and walked away. And what you can see is the warm areas where their body heat has gone out into the pew and through their feet into the floor. If there had been a cushion on this pew, if there had been a runner on the floor, then they would have been able to keep more of their body heat that they arrived with. They arrived warm, right? Then they sat down and they became cold. And that's because their body heat went out into the pew and into the floor. Now you need to do these things correctly. You've got to get the cushions right. You need runners which have breathable backs so you don't get condensation underneath them. But they're not complicated things to do and they don't cost the earth. This is a photograph simply of a radiator that hasn't been cleaned out. You can see the sludge in the middle. The radiator can't work efficiently because the sludge hasn't been cleared out. This is a church that's got underfloor heating, but they've moved the churches over here and they've moved the chairs over here to the right hand side. So the people over here aren't benefiting from this underfloor heating. And this one is just to make you smile. This is a toilet that has been plumbed into the hot water rather than the cold water. So it is glowing hot. Simple thing to fix. Should never have been done in the first place. What next? These are your kind of medium-sized projects. If you're a medium energy using church, you'd start looking at things like if you've got an easy to access loft void, looking insulating. It's important to say though that pretty much everything from here on, you need to get advice. It needs to be done right. It's always on a case-by-case basis. You want to be speaking to your DAC, you want to be speaking to your church architect. But given all of those caveats, insulating easy to access lofts, looking at things like partitioning off smaller areas which are easier to heat, draft lobbies, data loggers and smart meters. If you've got someone in your PCC who likes doing that kind of techie stuff and analysis, you can buy relatively inexpensive data loggers and find out how your church building responds as the heating comes on and off, and that can help you more accurately set your heating clock. Is zoning. This is one of the simplest things that we see done wrong, is where in order to have one area of the church be warm, the whole area of the church is being heated. If you can get some zones set up that work for you, that can either be through more complicated zoning, or it can be just putting thermostatic radiator valves on your radiators. Making sure your boiler temperatures are set correctly if you've got a gas or oil boiler. Thermal and motion sensors are things which trigger your lighting to come on as people move around the building. So that can be useful for areas like kitchens, and it can also be very useful if you have got the kind of church where you have drop-in visitors. Then having some thermal or motion sensors will mean that your lights just come on when somebody's walking around. And then the all-important heating. So over time, if we are to become a net zero carbon church, we have to move away from gas and oil space heating. And therefore we have to look at other low carbon solutions. And that's things like electric pew and panel heating. Why is this so important? So again, let's look at these 2 thermal imaging camera photographs. They show us what we know, which is that hot air rises. You turn your heater on, the hot air comes out, it goes up to the ceiling. So our basic start point at the moment, the basic place that we begin when we're thinking about our heating is space heating, which involves burning oil and gas somewhere in a cupboard in our building, using that oil or gas that we've burned to try and run hot water through our building that warms up hot air. The hot air rises, and then it has to fill all the way back down till it gets to the people before we start getting any benefit. We know those fossil fuels are contributing to climate change, and we know that hot air rises. So our basic start point, when you stop and think about it, is a little bit mad. What we need to do instead is take as a start point thinking, how are we going to make people comfortable? How are we going to make people comfortable in our buildings whilst conserving our interiors? And that's what leads you to things like pew heating. That leads you to things like far infrared radiant panel heaters here on the ceiling, these brown panels and the white panels over here that give out a safe form of radiation that warms surfaces. It leads you to things like chandelier heating, like these two here. I know they look slightly like UFOs, but they're actually heaters. And again, they're giving out a safe form of radiation that warms the surfaces that it touches. And it leads you to things like heat pumps. Although normally heat pumps are a relatively expensive intervention, so they make more sense with a bigger, busier church. You can get air source heat pumps, you can get ground source heat pumps. So they're acting like a fridge in reverse. They're taking warmth from the air or the ground outside the church, and they're using a pump and a compressor heat exchanger in order to warm up the inside of the church. Why it's so important to think about our heating is, firstly, generally people heating, let's call it that, is more efficient than space heating. So it cuts the energy that we use, and that cuts the gross carbon footprint. But also generally people heating solutions are electric, and therefore by switching to 100% renewable tariff, we've cut our net carbon footprint as well. So it's a double benefit. Section C of the Practical Path to Net Zero is those bigger projects, the getting to zero projects. And here, absolutely everything is case by case. They'll only be relevant for particular churches, and they need to be done with proper advice. You're looking at things like major draft proofing of windows, secondary or double glazing windows in busier areas, offices, halls, not the church stained glass. Draft proofing the tower ceiling if you have a tower, because that can act like a chimney, drawing the warm air up and out. Insulating under your pew platforms if you still have them. Potentially internally insulating suitable areas like halls, offices, vestries. Potentially reinstating ceilings if your church used to have one. Often back in their time, in their history, the church had an internal ceiling, and that's been ripped out at some point. For some churches, solar PV, and for some, major new lighting systems. In the right place, renewables can absolutely be part of the solution. If you look on our renewables map online, you can find that they've already been achieved in many places around the country. So each one of these dots is a church that's installed renewables somewhere in the country. There is still a perception it'll be very difficult to get permission, particularly for solar panels. This picture here is showing where they've just been installed on the cloisters of Salisbury Cathedral. In practice at the moment, when I ask my colleagues who deal with the Church Buildings Council casework and the Cathedral Fabric Commission of England casework, they say that very few cases are turned down. What they're seeing is very few applications that push the boundaries. And in the light of a climate emergency, both those two committees have been discussing very actively that they believe a strong case can be made for the public benefit, that public benefit of the clean energy can be given an increased weight when balanced against the harm to heritage. So by no means are those committees saying, yes, you can put solar panels everywhere on every listed building, but they are saying, please put in well-made applications for solar panels, for example, on potential on an aisle roof or on a secondary roof set back from the road. I've just covered that. Rules of visibility need to be tested. Only if these are things which are done in particular circumstances. So I'm not going to spend much time on them because they're only relevant for very particular church circumstances. But if you're re-roofing, you insulate. If you've got a cavity, think about cavity wall insulation. External renders if you're a suitable building that's very busy. Heat pumps if you've got a church that's being used all week round. If you've got a church that's being used all week round and you're lifting the floor anyway because it needs major maintenance, that's when you would think about underfloor heating. If nothing else is viable and you've got an old gas boiler or you've got an oil boiler, a new gas boiler is going to be better. But putting in a new gas boiler now it's going to last for 15, 20 years. That's going to take you right past that net zero by 2030 target. So please, please do a full options appraisal before you put in a new gas boiler. If you've got a lot of car use and you've got a car park, you might want to think about EV car charging points. How am I doing for time? 11:40. I think I've got time for this next section. So costings. From the energy audits, we got some rough costings. They are rough, but I'm giving them to you as an order of magnitude of what we think moving towards net zero is likely to cost. So let's start with our Sunday church that's doing all of those activities that are in step A of the practical path to net zero. The energy audits say that to get those basic steps done, it's going to cost something like £10,000 to £15,000. But much of this is needed anyway for basic maintenance. So much of this isn't new expenditure, it's fixing the broken windows, it's dealing with the gutters. The average Sunday church that's being used a few hours a week is paying £2,000 a year for its utility bills, and doing everything in step A, the energy audits tell us, will achieve something like a 50% reduction in energy, which means it's going to pay back in 10 to 15 years. So it's not an immediate payback, but it is doable. That leaves your remaining carbon footprint for your Sunday church of about 6 tonnes. And at the moment, if you wanted to offset that with someone like Climate Stewards, that would cost you £20 a tonne, so £120 a year to offset. So very roughly, and every church is so different, and you'll be thinking this through for your church and trying to apply it. But very roughly, we think that the cost to get to net zero for a Sunday church is going to be something like £10,000 to £15,000 in capital costs, but much of that is basic maintenance you'll be doing anyway, and then about £120 a year in offsetting the residue. Then we've got some of the bigger projects. I need to put even more caveats around this. When the energy audits give us prices for these bigger projects, they're for those specific churches where it's being recommended, and therefore the energy auditor is thinking that in this church it's a cost-effective thing to do. So they're not saying that for any church anywhere this is what they would cost. They're saying for this church in these circumstances this is what I think it would cost. And the costs in the energy audits exclude professional advice, planning and scaffolding. It's only for the installation. So given those caveats, and keep all those caveats in mind, air source heat pump, you're looking at £20,000 to £30,000 and carbon saving about 41%, so very significant. Under pew heating, less capital, very similar carbon savings, but relevant in different churches. These solutions are for different churches. These are for churches where under pew heating makes sense. These are for churches where air source heat pumps make sense. Solar panels, £17,000, 20% carbon saving, replacing the boiler, £11,000, 13% carbon saving. And insulating the roof. This is assuming that you've got an easy to access roof void, because this wouldn't be being recommended in churches that didn't. You're looking at a few £1,000s for the materials and a carbon saving that's relatively low. Where do you begin? In terms of where I would say for any church to begin is work out your current energy footprint. So for those of you who are joining from Church of England churches, you have the ability to use the Church of England energy footprint tool. It's built into the online parish return system. You go in and you click in on the green box, you put in your utility bills, the size of the church, the usage of the church, and it gives you your energy footprint. These are on zero because I haven't put any data in. It gives you your gross carbon footprint, your net carbon footprint, a weather adjusted figure, which is the best one to compare year on year on year. And it gives you your energy efficiency per meter squared and per person hour. And this one on the right is really important, because if you're a really busy, successful church that's running 3 activities a day, every day throughout the week, then your carbon footprint might be quite high, but your emissions per person hour are probably really low. If you want to go beyond that, or if you're a non-CFE church joining today, then go to 360 Degree Carbon. 360 Degree Carbon is an online tool where you enter the data about your energy use, your transport, your food, things that you purchase, and your waste and water, and it gives you a carbon footprint for all of that. So it goes much further than the Church of England's energy footprint tool, but it takes a lot longer to do. We think it's a really good next step for the keen eco churches, where the EFT alone doesn't give them that richness that they want of knowing their full carbon footprint. And I mentioned this as I went along, but another good place to start can be to buy some relatively inexpensive data loggers. There's different brands, but they sort of look like this. You leave them around the church for a few weeks, and they measure the humidity and the temperature, and then you plug them into your laptop, upload the data, and analyze the lovely graphs. So you need someone on your PCC who thinks that analyzing lovely graphs is their kind of thing. But what it can show you is when your heating system clicks on and off, how long it takes your church to warm up, and then how long it takes your church to cool down again when you turn off the heating. And that can then allow you to adjust your timing clock so the heating comes on only when you need it and off when you need it. Next steps are, I'd always say a good first place is to calculate your carbon footprint, switch to 100% renewables. If you follow the links from the document I showed you this morning, you can find our energy efficient guidance, and you can find the practical path to net zero guidance, and that self-guided checklist that we have for the practical path, which you can then get 2 or 3 people from your church, get the self-guided checklist from the practical path, and just work through it line by line and talk about, is this step relevant to us? Another really useful thing is to get the Eco Church survey. You can get the buildings section of the Eco Church survey, have a look at that. Between those two things, the Eco Church survey and the practical path to net zero, hopefully that will lead you to an action plan for your church. So if you leave today thinking, right, what are we going to do? I would say work out your carbon footprint, switch to renewables, and then get those 2 documents, practical path to net zero and the Eco Church building survey, and sit down with someone else in your church who's interested in these things, go through those documents, and that will lead you toward an action plan. Of course, the other thing is thinking about, should you be having a PCC motion for net zero by 2030 if you haven't already got one? That's a slightly different conversation. That's about engaging a far wider group of people in your church, but it's definitely worth considering. If you're joining from I'm not sure if anyone has joined from a diocese today, so let me go quite quickly. If you're joining from a diocese, it's encouraging people to do the EFT, it's encouraging people to switch to renewables, finding those key bits of advice and communicating them as widely as you can, getting a sustainability policy for your diocese, and Gloucester Diocese has got a really good one you can start with, and then thinking about the skills of the advisors that you have in your DAC. That will lead you to an action plan for your diocese, and again, a diocesan motion of net zero by 2030. Finally, I showed you them this morning in my little slot then, but please do come to the webinars. They're absolutely designed to help churches make changes in their heating and their lighting, in solar panels, in fundraising. They are there to help you, and they are all free to come to. And once they're completed, the videos go on the website so you can watch them later. That is me done. Now, how am I doing on timing? I think we're expecting the others back in 5 minutes time, so I've probably got time for 1 or 2 questions. Anyone got a burning question? We're a relatively small group, so you can probably just put your hand up and speak, or put it in the chat as you prefer. Oh, no. I don't know if that's because I've scared you or because I've answered every question that you had. Joanna.
And it's really interesting looking at this, and it's really helpful. We haven't started a journey yet in our congregation, and it's something I've got a PCC meeting on Monday that I want to start talking about. But just while listening to quite a number of things, they're quite counter to the current advice we have on keeping our buildings safe for COVID. So where we've removed all the soft furnishings and we're having our windows open and our doors open, as I'm just kind of wrestling with how I start talking about this and this advice, bearing in mind that in another part of the meeting I'll be saying, but actually we have to be doing these things too. So it's just, do you have any reflection on that?
No, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I should have said that at the beginning. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'll remember to do that this afternoon. So everything I've spoken about is in the context of the longer term. At the moment, absolutely, be doing the right things to follow the COVID guidance. I'm talking the longer term as you move between now and 2030. And I'm assuming in my longer term that COVID is less of an ever-present concern.
Thank you.
How many? Oh, sorry, I just saw Leslie put her hand up.
I can't see a hand up other than yours.
How many?
Oh, Leslie, sorry. Okay, well, we'll do Claire then, Leslie.
How many people is a good number of people to get these things moving in a church? Like, do you need to? Can you do it as an individual within your church? Do you need a full-on committee and a group? What's your experience of working with churches on this?
I think if you've got just one person, it's going to be very, very, very hard work. I'm not sure that you need a whole committee. Most churches will already have a fabric committee that a lot of these decisions would go to. But equally, having a group, I think, can be very helpful. And if you think of it depends a little bit if you're focusing just on net zero or whether you're focusing on eco-church. But if you're focusing on eco-church, actually, because it covers the buildings and the land and the worship, community engagement, those are different passions for different people. So it could be really useful to try and gather a group where you've maybe got somebody who's really interested in each of those 5 themes and leads on that theme within the church. When you're looking just at the buildingsy stuff, you really, really want to be engaging your church warden. You really, really want to be engaging your treasurer. And I would say the earlier that you can do that, the earlier you can have those people working with you, it's far more likely you'll end up being able to actually implement something. Leslie, you, I think, had a question. You're on mute, so you'll have to click the button. Leslie, you're on mute.
Right, sorry, how do we find out if our DAC has got a policy?
I would contact your DAC secretary. Do you know who that is?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I know I've got it somewhere in my paperwork, yeah. Right, thank you.